Good afternoon, folks. What we're going to talk about today is a quick way to make sure that when you're sanding down seams and making them smooth, to make sure that you've got it right. Now, one of the easiest ways to do this, let's hold on a second. Let's talk about what we're actually getting into. So this is the assembled wing section of an F-86 Saber. If you look at one of the previous videos, you can see kind of the beginning stages of working on this. So as you can see here, we have the bottom wing section, which is one piece minus the flaps, of course, and then the upper wing, which is actually two separate pieces, so you have one on each side. Now, oftentimes when you put sections like this together, you will get a seam running down the leading edge, wrapping around the tip, and then across the back side. Now, if you sand these down using a good file or something, you can get a pretty good finish, but oftentimes when you go ahead and paint it, especially if you're using flat paint, you will end up seeing the seam reappear. That can be really frustrating when you have, a shot with an airbrush, or if you use rattle cans and you do a really nice job, everything looks excellent, and then once it dries, you see that seam appear. It can be very frustrating. So we're going to talk about a simple way to eliminate that. All you need is a bottle of flat paint that is slightly a different color than what you're working on. Now, you want to stay away from black and very dark colors, and the reason being is that when you're using dark colors like that, they tend to ruin sanding sticks quicker. The paints go on thicker because there's so much pigment in them. You really want something thin. So what I'm using right here is a Model Master flat gray. Now, if you look closely at the paint, you can see that it's separated. I haven't used this color in a while. So you want to make sure that you shake paint up really well before you use it. If you're a beginning modeler, you may not have experienced the horror that comes with not properly shaking up a bottle of paint before you use it, but let me just say it can be an absolute nightmare. You don't shake it up properly, there can be clumps, or the pigment is not consistent throughout, it doesn't dry properly, all kinds of things can go wrong. So make sure that you shake paint up really well. And don't just shake it until it all looks uniform from the outside. I usually shake mine for about a minute before I even try to open the bottle. So you have your paint, get that nice and shaken up. Just a nice little paintbrush. You can see right here, this is one of the standard testers paintbrushes, not one of the nicer ones out there. We're not really doing anything super detailed or anything that we need to be concerned about. So just something that's going to allow you to put a nice thin coat of paint on. As always, make sure your paintbrushes are clean and dry before you use them. And then a sanding stick. Now, I like to buy sanding sticks from the women's beauty section, and the reason being is that you can get some really effective nail files and sanding sticks that don't have too much grit to them, that don't scratch the plastic so deeply as they're sanding it. So this one right here, this side, the sparkly side, is actually pretty useless to me. It's very fine, and I have not yet found a use for it. But this side right here is about the perfect grit for what we're going to be doing. So just really those three things, and make sure once again that the glue has set perfectly and is completely set before you start doing any of this. If you start sanding on parts that the glue has not set yet, you can pop seams apart and things like that. So you just want to be careful with that. So once again, we make sure our paint is very well shaken up. Once we're sure that our paint is good and shaken up, we'll go ahead and open it up. Now, you're not going to need a lot of paint for this, so usually I will just dip the paintbrush in the cap of the jar. That usually gets a sufficient amount. And then you're just going to put a nice light coat of paint across the seam and make sure that you cover up any gaps or anything like that. That is what's going to help us identify problem areas once the paint is dried. And take your time. As with anything when building models, take your time. If you're in a rush to get things done, you'll find that you make mistakes, you don't notice things as much, so always just take your time. Also, you want to get a nice thin coat of paint on here. You don't want it to be thick, because if you get it on too thick, then you have to sand off all of the paint before you prepare for airbrushing or anything like that, in order to prevent seeing the brush strokes and stuff from thick paint underneath the final coat. So you're just going to go all across the edge, that seam where the two parts meet, and put a nice thin coat of paint covering it all. like that. I know it's really hard to see because I use a color of gray that is just very close to the tone of the plastic. But once you have all of that accomplished and you've got the whole seam, you're going to let this paint dry. I would say for at least 8 hours. I usually I'll paint something and I'll let it dry, you know, overnight. I won't come back to it, you know. But that gives you an opportunity to work on things in stages, do some sub-assemblies, do some detail work and so on while this dries, and then come back to it the next day. So like I said, you're going to do that across the entire seam, even the trailing edge of the wing, which is very, very thin in comparison to the leading edge, but still can produce some seams. And then like there's a problem area right here where when I glued it together, just a little bit of glue popped out of the seam, which will happen now and again. But this method is going to help you identify those problem areas and sand them off before final painting, so you don't have to deal with the frustration of having a really nice coat of paint that you now have to redo because you have to sand off a seam or something like that. So we will come back to this once again in an additional video once the paint is dried. So probably tomorrow afternoon we'll work on this some more, and we'll be able to more clearly identify some problem areas and some things that need work. And I'll show you how to use that nice nail file from the women's beauty section to eliminate these seams before final painting. As one final note, as you can see on the wing here, there's a pitot tube sticking out of it. This is actually molded into the wing. If you have a kit where pitot tubes are installed and are not molded onto the wing, I highly recommend gluing the wing together and then installing the pitot tubes after. That will allow you to sand the wing much more effectively, to handle it and manipulate the wing surface during assembly without danger of accidentally knocking off that pitot tube. So once again, just a nice thin coat of paint across the seam, making sure you get everything, including like the landing lights and stuff like that. Model building is all about the details. So if you have a very nice finished model, a very nice paint job, everything looks excellent, and there's just that one little thing that sticks out. You know, the seam on the entire wing looks perfect, and then you see that landing light with a seam down the center of it. It really distracts and you know, from the overall quality of the kit. So I try to make sure I don't miss any details. This may seem like, you know, a long time. You know, I said that, you know, you want to let the paint dry thoroughly before you start messing with it, but the final finished product really shows the amount of time and effort that you put into these things. So we have our seam painted, so we'll go ahead and close up our paint. I always close up paint before I do anything else, just because I do not want to knock it over. I haven't done that since, you know, my early days of model building, but the horror of having my father come into my room and find paint spilled on my carpet is enough to make sure I never do it again. Always, once again, make sure you clean your paint brushes very thoroughly. As you can see, I'm just using standard Testors or Model Master paint thinner, and just switch the paintbrush back and forth a good number of times. You'll see the paint start to wisp off the brush, and then just kind of, you know, lightly touch the brush to the edge of the rim as you take it out. And then I have my t-shirt here that I drape over the arm of my chair, and just in a painting motion rub it off on the t-shirt. And if you see any of the pigment of the paint come off of the brush onto the t-shirt, then you need to go back into the thinner and switch it some more until you can touch it to the shirt and no pigment comes off. That will help you ensure that your paint brushes are clean every time, and give you a long life and a lot of use out of the paint brushes. Alright, well, thank you very much for today. If you have any questions or comments, please feel free to leave them on the video. And please make sure you visit us on Facebook, YouTube, and Google+.